Hello everyone, this is Andrew. Welcome to Keen on America.
On July 4th, 2026, America will be 250 years old. An anniversary that will, no doubt, be greeted with a mixture of celebration, contemplation, and resignation. In Keen on America, Andrew talks not just about the American past and present, but also speculates on its future. What, Andrew asks, will be the 21st century fate of this now venerable American republic?
Hello everybody, it is Friday, June the 27th, 2025. Yesterday we did a show with the historian Brenda Wineapple on the Scopes trial. She has a new book out about it, Keeping the Faith. It's the 100th year anniversary of Scopes next month. And we talked about how, in some ways, two strains of American history were present at Scopes, a certain conspiratorial way of looking at the world versus a more scientific one. This theme is one that we've pursued very often in this show. We did a show relatively recently with Eric Peterson, the author of a book about eugenics, The Shortest History of Eugenics, which suggests that the theory of eugenics, of racial superiority, was very much alive in America in the late 19th century. And just as those kind of racial theories were existent in the 19th century, they've reappeared the beginning of the 21st century. A couple of weeks ago, we did a show with another historian, Deborah Baker, whose book on Charlottesville speaks of what she describes as the reappearance of American fascism. And we're joining the dots together with my guest, Philip Kadish. He is a professor of American Studies at Pace University and the author of an intriguing new book, The Great White Hoax, 2 Centuries of Selling Racism in America. Philip is joining us from the Upper West Side in New York City. Philip, welcome. Congratulations on the new book. Are you joining the dots here? There are many other books. I'm sure you've read some of them and you've perused others about this history of scientific racism in America.
Absolutely. Well, first of all, I just want to say thank you again for having me on the show. And I was taking some notes even as you were doing your introduction. I was interested in this combination you were saying, sort of contrasting the idea of scientific thinking versus conspiratorial thinking. And one interesting part of my findings in my book is really that those two things can and have gone together. So what my book about is sort of my discovery of this phenomenon that I call the Great White Hoax, which is a period from the 1830s until the Second World War, when there were a regular series of elaborate public deceptions designed to create false evidence to back up one or another racist theory of the day.
Are these, for you, Philip, and obviously this stuff is controversial on lots of levels, are these conscious hoaxes? Do people actually know that they were inventing something that was fraudulent, or did some of them actually believe in these hoaxes? Because, of course, eugenics, as Peterson explained when he came on the show, I mean, a lot of people believed in it. It seemed, at least from some people's perspective, to have a scientific foundation, or at least a quasi-scientific foundation.
Yes, it's a very good distinction to make, and it's one that I make in the book. The thing that really characterizes the particular thread that I am following in my book and things that I was finding is that they all involved varying degrees of a kind of cynical, very self-aware, purposeful deception. Some of them, it was all the way over on, the 100% side of the meter, and we can talk about some examples of that. But even the ones that involved certain members contributing to it having what we can think of more as perhaps what I often call kind of earnest racism, and distinguishing it from the fully cynical kind of manipulations that I'm writing about often in the book. A number of the hoaxes involve people who sort of fully believed what they were saying and had what psychologists often call motivated reasoning, right? They're fully invested in their ideas about race, and they believe the kind of conclusions that they're coming to. But in a number of the things that I end up including in the hoax, there are people who fold the material that some of those people came up with into very self-aware, sort of fraudulent salesmanship and manipulation.
I thought you were going to say Freudian rather than fraudulent. I would guess one of these characters, and we'll come to him later in our conversation, is Madison Grant, one of the fathers, if that's the right word, of eugenicist theory. Was there something unique about the history of this, what you call this great white hoax in America? Of course, America is relatively unique in its history, certainly of slavery and then of the Civil War. But there were many other racial theories brewing in Europe in the late 19th century. Of course, they eventually matured into fascism. Was America like Europe in that sense, or was it different?
Well, I mean, I think America had its very own take on and its own uses of racism and its own modes. A thing that I would point out as I have gone through the various episodes that I write about is that they were all very much sort of taking advantage of a particular need or hunger. I sometimes even call it a market opportunity in American culture at a particular moment, where the culture was kind of hungry to be reassured or morally soothed or justified about taking some kind of action to either protect existing institutions or laws or create new ones to sort of protect white advantage in the U.S. One episode that I talk about in the book is that the fact that so racial science comes out of Germany and Europe in the late 18th century, and folks in the U.S. who are educated know about it, but it doesn't become a significant contributor to U.S. culture and politics until it becomes politically useful in the 1830s and 40s. And suddenly there is this great utility seen in it. I could give you the illustrating story to that if you like.
Of course.
Absolutely. So I would say part of what's unique here is that we obviously had this train of racial science coming out of Europe, and which I would say has a combination of motivations, some of them relatively benign about learning about the world, and also justifications of European colonization around the world. But in the US, slavery, for the most part, in the late 18th, early 19th century, was justified either on bald kind of economic grounds. So Thomas Jefferson called it a necessary evil. So acknowledging that it was wrong, but saying, well, we need it economically. Or they would try to make religious justifications for it. It appears in the Bible and so forth. But it was tough because at that time, culture was very religious, and even science at the time really had to conform with the Bible. And you have this episode in 1840. I'll try to recount it to you quickly. 1840 US Census, for the first time, they are asking questions about health with no racist intention. It's a benevolent intention. They want to see, do we need more hospitals or sanitariums in the country? And the census comes back with the startling data that, according to their data collected, that Black Americans are 11 times more prone to what they called insanity and idiocy. So what we would think nowadays as mental illness or cognitive impairment. So they were 11 times more likely to have those conditions, supposedly, outside of slavery than in slavery. And the data also showed that they were more and more prone to it the farther north they got from the slave states. And so this was startling data. People weren't looking to have found to, they weren't collecting this data in order to find this, but people who were pro-slavery loved it. It was very politically useful to them. And people who were against slavery were shocked by it. But here it was. It had this enormous authority. It had the authority of being stamped by the US government. And it had the authority of this new science.
But I take your point, Philip. But was it true? I mean, was this a?
Well, yes. Well, so here's the interesting thing about this particular episode. This early episode did not start as a hoax. It basically started as a fiasco. Some statisticians quickly went through the records and determined that in the North, they had just bungled the collection. So, for instance, they had towns in New England where the number of what they would have said Negroes at the time, they would have said they had 2 Negroes in the town, but 14 insane ones and 3 idiot ones. Or towns with supposedly no Black members, but a certain number of African-American insane. And so it has simply been bungled. And they later realized that in the South, that it was against the law to admit Black people to sanitariums and to asylums, and that's why they weren't finding any. So here's the thing. It was brought to the person who at the moment was in charge of the census, who was unfortunately, John Calhoun, the great propagandist of slavery. And this data was so useful to him that he recertified it. So this was a case of starting out as an accident, but then he knowingly investigated it, saw the falseness, and then recertified it. And it then went out in the world as fact. And that information was then used in the defense of slavery for decades. But also, it was used as the building block. That data set, that incorrect data set, knowingly falsely propagated, was the first data set in American scientific racism. It really set off a gold rush of studies in the US. That's when the US began producing its own scientific data and theories and so forth.
And going back to, and I want to come back to this later, the Scopes trial and this division in America, did the appearance of these sort of studies, supposedly scientific, but as you suggested, based on dubious science at best, did it create a debate? Were there scientists, real scientists in America, real researchers, data crunchers, who recognized the problems here?
Well, it was a mix. So we had real statisticians and doctors who saw very quickly the problems, for instance, in that census data. But the data still stood. Scientists around the world accepted it, right? So there's also this issue of science is at one level a pursuit of truth and information, but it's also a social system in which there are powers. But all through the years, all through the different episodes that I talk about in the book, you very often have competing voices within science. So you were bringing up Madison Grant from the early 20th century and his ideas about the Nordicism, that there's supposedly being a Nordic race within European whites that was biologically superior and had he was crediting with most of the civilizational accomplishments. And at the same time, you have Franz Boas at the exact same time. So you have these sort of competing forces. And one of the interesting things that I follow is even in moments when there are competing forces and contending figures within science, at any given moment, one of them doesn't, for instance, in the long run, Grant doesn't win that debate within science, but he certainly won it enough to influence and help push through the 1924 Immigration Act, which radically changed immigration to the U.S. with racist restrictions on Eastern and Southern Europeans, Asians.
In terms of your interpretation of somebody like Grant, Philip,
Mm-hmm.
was he, in your view at least, the racist who used science to justify his own theories? Or was he a bad scientist? I mean, what's your interpretation?
Yes. I would say yes to both of those things. He was absolutely a committed racist. It turns out, people like Stephen Jay Gould have kind of famously gone back through some of the data of people like this and seen this kind of errors in their logic. And the curious thing about Madison Grant is that he was really considered a kind of supreme expert about race among the kind of elite universities and well-educated set, the rich philanthropies at the time. But he did not have a degree in biology. He was trained as a lawyer. And one of the things I follow in the book very much, in addition to the racist ideas in particular, is just how did public authority get developed for ideas? So with Madison Grant, the reason he was trusted about race by all of these politicians and wealthy philanthropists is because he came from a very wealthy family himself. They'd all known him socially. And his early career, he was a conservationist. And I sort of quip in my book that if he had been hit by a car or, as I say, run over by a buffalo, which I'll explain in a second, earlier in his life, he'd be remembered now only as one of the great early conservationists in American culture.
Yeah, he has a touch of the Teddy Roosevelts about him.
Absolutely, absolutely.
And so his twirled moustache. And yes, he was,
exactly.
The son, as you say, of very... So coming back to...
well, if I can just make one very quick connection here, which is just he developed the concept of preserves. So having preserves for the buffalo, having preserves, protecting the redwoods in California. And he ended up transferring those concepts to preserving what he called the Nordic race. And so he's really a bridge between various kinds of European racism at the time and policy, right? The Immigration Act being a transposition onto human culture of the idea of creating a preserve. So he wanted the U.S. to be a preserve to protect Nordics by excluding Jews and Italians and Russians.
Even Irish, I would guess. In terms of your research in the book and all the reading you've done about what you call the Great White Hoax, I mean, it requires a believing public one way or the other. There are always quacks, crazies, perhaps like Madison Grant around, but it requires a public to digest and enthuse about these sorts of things. What was the response broadly of Americans in the 1920s and 30s to Grant's ideas? Did you get a sense that, shall we say, white Americans, particularly upper class white Americans, wanted to believe this stuff, that they were friendly to this science, that they weren't particularly interested in the science, but they liked its conclusions? It made them feel more comfortable. Was it an idea or an ideology that was more attractive to rich whites or poor whites?
Interesting. I would say that particularly the kind of detailed analysis and scientific pretense of his work, I think very much appealed to wealthy and more educated white people in the country. But his work was seized upon by people who had already been organizing, very wealthy people, been organizing to try to restrict immigration for a number of years before he got involved with them. And they kept failing. And they kept being unable. They ran into resistance from the members of Congress from immigrant districts, and there was bad optics to being discriminatory. And so this kind of scientific gloss that he could bring to this, that this was somehow objective, but fully scientific, gave a great cover. But in terms of, it wasn't all rich people. So one of the people who really was right there to get that immigration law passed was a man named Johnson. He was a representative from Oregon, a KKK member, and very much a kind of lower middle class, concrete, wearing a hood kind of racist. And he liked the idea that this blue blood from the East Coast was coming and giving him a respectable way to do what he was looking to do anyway.
Yeah, and it brings back what we talked about earlier, the Scopes trial. William Jennings Bryan, who of course who argued at Scopes against the teaching of evolutionism and wanted to put a Tennessean teacher called John Scopes in jail, was himself, of course, a quote unquote progressive populist. He ran for president 3 times as a Democrat. So the politics of this are complicated. Philip, in Europe, of course, all these ideas ended in some ways in the gas chambers and with mad scientists, mad evil scientists like Mengele at Auschwitz. Did the same happen in America?
Yes. As I was doing the research for this book, I first found one and then another and another, and this pattern seemed to keep extending. And then I realized that it basically stopped right around the end of the Second World War. In terms of the specific phenomenon that I was looking at, which was elaborate, intentional, fully racist manufacture of false evidence of either racial inferiority or of conspiracies against white dominance. We can talk about that if you want. But essentially, as I was looking into why did it stop and what happened to that impulse, and essentially what you have is between the war against the Nazis and the horrors at Nazi crimes, but also years of propaganda where really for the first time, the US began depicting itself to itself as sort of somehow by definition not anti-racist, right? The wartime propaganda of look at our wonderfully mixed tank crews with the Italian and the Swede and so forth, and that we're the opposite of the Nazis. So it became sort of socially unacceptable to be making such openly racist arguments. And then science itself basically abandoned first the idea of racial hierarchy, and then quite soon the idea of race itself. And so my book doesn't stop there, however. Basically, the last chapter of my book is about what happened to those impulses in the period right afterwards. And I basically look at it through the character of George Wallace of Alabama. And basically what happens when someone wants to be able to protect the structures and institutions and modes of white supremacy, but you no longer have access to these open, unembarrassed, full-fledged kind of racist arguments. And one thing is that if it's no longer socially acceptable to make those kinds of arguments openly, then manufacturing fake evidence for them becomes less necessary, and things shift into a kind of coded mode. And so in the book, I follow him from early things like, he's very much defending segregation, but he shifts, and while we're talking about states' rights, or he's developing language talking about the federal government as a tyranny and sort of shifting the topic, or depicting the quest for civil rights for African Americans as communist. And he ends up discovering that although he is reviled in many parts of the country for all of that, he also finds that there's an audience for his messages, his kind of coded messages. And he ends up running for president and doesn't win, but in my analysis ends up sort of setting up the kind of playbook that will eventually.
Right, and you're certainly not the first or the last to come up with this narrative. Lots of books, we've done a lot of them on the Southern strategy, on Nixon and Goldwater and the incorporation of this in. Is there a danger, though, Philip, in your way of thinking and in this narrative, to fall into the very trap that you're trying to critique? That you're looking at history with a racial lens, so everything becomes about race and racial superiority. And you're doing exactly what you're accusing the George Wallaces and the Madison Grants, that everything can be written about in racial terms if those are the lenses that you're using.
Well, I certainly would not be one to say that race is the only thing that determines, what's happened in U.S. culture. But in terms of the particular project that I had, which was having seen a long time pattern of it being very useful and sort of politically and often financially profitable to create false evidence of supporting racism, the question was, well, I wonder what happened to it. I wonder where it went. A basic thing that I would note and that I would observe and point out to folks is that, for instance, the kinds of things that someone might call sort of racist political deceptions in our politics in the later 20th century. So let's say talking about Reagan's rhetoric about the welfare queen, right? So the argument about that is he exaggerated about a case of someone doing a sort of extreme version of cheating the system as a way to avoid giving out more benefits and kind of a racialized depiction of it. But in that case, there was a real person, right? There was a real person who was in fact a pretty good con artist. And Reagan didn't invent a person. He didn't hire an actor to portray that person. Like, that's the kind of thing that was going on in the
I mean, Clinton did that, of course, and there really was a person called Sister Soldier, for better or worse. So coming back to the core thesis in the book, American culture was, it seems, dominated by this scientific racism. The first, I don't know whether we call it great Hollywood movie, certainly the most significant Hollywood movie was Birth of a Nation, which distilled your scientific racist ideology. And then very powerful industrialists like Henry Ford promoted this racial theory, as well as things like the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. Did it manifest itself politically in a kind of America First isolationism in the 1930s?
In terms of isolationism, I'm actually not sure in terms of that particular thing. Most of what I have studied as usually has to do with domestic policy rather than foreign policy. But certainly a sense of who was worth. Well, I think I may just stay there. I may try to stay within my.
So what happened to D.W. Griffith and Henry Ford after the Second World War, when the truth of the gas chambers and the Nazis came out? Did they? And I'm not even sure if they were still around. Ford died in 1947. I'm not sure when D.W. Griffiths died, but were there public acknowledgements by some of these people that their flirtation with this kind of racial theory was incredibly dangerous and deeply un-American?
So neither of them survived into the period where the culture really shifted after the Holocaust and all of that. But they were certainly pushed back against, by the in the 1930s, Ford backed off. So that's also kind of an interesting story. He kind of pushes very heavily promoting the Protocols of Zion, which was itself a hoax. And interestingly, it's not a hoax that he created, right? It's a hoax that was created in Russia. He was sort of hoodwinked by it. But in the middle of his campaign about it, it's revealed pretty conclusively that it to have been a hoax, and he plows ahead anyway. So one of the other things in my book, looking at both with the public, but also in some cases with the people involved in propagating the hoaxes, what do people do when something is revealed to have been a hoax and yet is enormously appealing to them? So in the case of Ford, he just ignored it and plowed on ahead. But I would say over half of the hoaxes that I describe in the book were revealed as hoaxes in the midst of them, and yet were still embraced by many people, and often for a long time afterwards.
Fast forwarding, Philip, and it's hard not to think of America in 2025 in the context of your book, The Great White Hoax. Think of somebody like RFK Jr. I'm not sure if he is on the record of science and race, but he's certainly seen as anti-scientific and developing one kind of hoax or another. How would RFK Jr.'s movement and his thinking fit into your narrative? Is it separate or somehow connected?
Well, let's see. In terms of RFK Jr., he occasionally touches on sort of racially questionable theories. He sort of has made statements.
But my question is more now, sorry to interrupt.
Yeah.
I acknowledge that probably RFK Jr. is not particularly interested one way or the other in eugenics or racial theory, but he's certainly someone who uses what he claims to be scientific theory to question the scientific establishment. And a lot of people believe that a lot of this is just nonsense or propaganda. Is there a connection between what RFK Jr. is doing with science, using his own claims to science to peddle an anti-scientific method and message, and what the people you wrote about in The Great White Hoax did when it came to race?
Well, one thing I would note is that, if we look at someone like RFK, he's someone who is not himself a scientist, but who has a combination of celebrity. He has a platform, and he has been able to get himself into a position of power. And those things themselves can be enough to have a great influence on what is or isn't considered science at a particular moment. One thing that I observe in the book, and I'm not making a kind of one-to-one direct or causal link in it necessarily, but just observing that since the time period when science gave up on racism, in that same time period, in the last 50, 60 years, a lot of people have kind of given up on science. I don't think that's the only reason. There are a lot of complicated factors, but some of the scientific theories that are propagated by folks in my book stuck around, and they were more on the margin. There are still people who would prefer to believe them. But we've also, and there's become, between the decline of sort of faith in science, but also in elites and our increasingly siloed kind of media culture, a lot of people have become very skeptical about scientific authorities and government authorities on topics that they don't agree with. And then you end up with also the creation of alternative universes of authority.
Speaking of alternative universes, Philip, I know you write in the book about Roger Ailes, who's the father of Fox News. When you switch on Fox News, if you happen to, sometimes one gets the sense that they're inventing everything they talk about, presenting it as truth, scientific or otherwise. In your narrative of the Great White Hoax, would you include somebody like Ailes and indeed Fox News as an inheritor of Henry Ford and of the birth of a nation and even of Madison Grant?
I would, but it's also I would add some other streams to it. So part of what I would note about Roger Ailes is that so in the way he comes into my story is that I tell a quick story about him being in the Nixon White House and this proposal coming across Nixon's desk, which he is given to look at, proposing that the way to get around coverage they don't like in the media is to create a Republican Party-owned news channel. They don't end up doing that. Nixon doesn't do that, but we have Ailes's notes on the document, thinking this is a fantastic idea. So part of what Fox News is certainly emblematic of is an increased and intensified partisanship in our media, absolutely. And one of the things I point out in the book is that to people who were alive in the end of the 20th century, that seems increasingly foreign and unprecedented. But in fact, for most of US history, media was very partisan. Newspapers were owned by political parties and so forth. And I would connect it to, there are times when they seem to be inventing stories. He essentially, they admitted such in court, I believe, or court cases about what they were, whether they're telling the truth or not on their stations. But another thing I would point out is that the Murdoch, despite, he's certainly a conservative, but he also saw a big market opportunity in being able to sell appealing stories and appealing spins on events, whether or not they were true or accurate, to a large audience. And one of the things that I hadn't necessarily been expecting to find, that I did find in my research, was that a number of these hoaxes were not created by people who were to the death racial ideologues, but they were just sort of about as racist as other folks in their era, but they saw a profit opportunity. So there are a number of the hoaxers in my book who I would compare more to someone like Alex Jones.
The ultimate capitalist. So you're bringing in capitalism here as the co-defendant or the co-accused in all this. News is a complicated business. We did a show a few weeks ago about Walter Lippmann, of course, who understood the challenges of telling the truth in media as well as anyone throughout the 20th century. Philip, that you're clearly a progressive, you're clearly critical of this movement, but progressives in this country are trying to figure out how to attract people in a passionate way without devolving into vulgar racism or vulgar sexism of one kind or another. I talked about this with Wineapple yesterday about the appeal of somebody like William Jennings Bryan. That's not to justify him, but what has your book, in terms of the research, The Great White Hoax, 2 Centuries of Selling Racism in America, taught you about how to sell ideas in politics? Maybe not an idea as unpleasant or as offensive as racism, but are there lessons from your book which progressives might draw more positively rather than just another critique of the deep racism in American history and culture?
Oh, it's an interesting question. I think that one of the basic things that I saw, just in terms of getting ideas out to the public and helping them to gain credibility, is that every single one of these hoaxes, and whatever, if you lay aside moral judgment, these are all successful instances of people really getting ideas out to the public. They all piggybacked on something that people already believed in, right? Some form of authority that they had some faith in, and that you could then build from. So that, I'm not saying that that's a revolutionary observation, but whether it was religion or science or people's trust in what they see in the newspaper, it's certainly in terms of basic technique. I think maybe in terms of what lessons might anything in my book have for people of a more progressive bent, I would say that, point out that the book also includes people pushing back against these messages when they were happening. So, for instance, Ida B. Wells, Frederick Douglass in 19th century, early 20th century for Ida B. Wells. And I found that if I can take a moment just to quickly tell the bit about Ida B. Wells from our story, one that I found very interesting as a model for just how do we think about the world and how do we understand what the real problems are. So Ida B. Wells was a journalist and an activist in Memphis, and she was very aware, obviously, in the 1890s, so very aware of the Jim Crow culture, very aware of lynching. And what she says is that she had believed that there was may have been a big crime problem among African Americans, but the problem was they weren't getting justice, right? They weren't getting their day in court. They were being murdered until a friend of hers was lynched for something that she was convinced he couldn't have done. She ended up doing a bunch of research, realizing, in fact, he hadn't done it. He'd been kind of framed, and did all this research and discovered that, in fact, many of the people who had been lynched in the South, in fact, had been set up or accused by either white lovers who regretted it or business partners. And she ended up revealing that the larger additional problem, beyond the obvious problem of it's a problem to get murdered for something you didn't do, is that it began to create these statistics about Black criminality. And it created this larger reality, and that was an illusion. And so even Frederick Douglass ended up writing to her and saying, you've taken the scales off my eyes. And I hadn't even seen that there was a larger problem here of these sort of false accusations, but also a kind of false characterization of what's happening in the community. And so that notion of trying to really understand what exactly is going on and where do your efforts need to go is an interesting example that perhaps someone could take and apply today.
And finally, Philip, I mean, in your view, there's a great debate within science and within particularly, I think, social science about whether it's even legitimate to study the differences between peoples of different colors or cultures. Do you think we should just stay clear of it? It's so politically dangerous, so fraught with dangers, and particularly your book, The Great White Hoax, uncovers that. Should it be something that we just, if not ban, just basically fundamentally discourage polite society, polite academic society? There's a great deal of debate. You mentioned Stephen Jay Gould, but lots of other social scientists have edged towards some of this, and there's a great deal of pushback as well. Should we have any kind of social or hard science that studies the difference in races or cultures?
That studies the differences as opposed to studying anything about the existence.
Well, by definition, I mean, I think some people argue that even the act of trying to study it is by definition racist. Do you agree?
I certainly don't. I understand where that impulse can come from. I think in its best form, that impulse towards colorblindness can be, well, if preoccupation with race has caused so much trouble, let's all just sort of forget about it. I think on a social level, it's just dishonest because it does affect everyone every day. It's very socially real for people. And so to be able to study, the impacts of social policies or of economics on how they affect different people who experience things differently socially is absolutely legitimate. I also think that one thing I would hope, and I know it can be a delicate thing, is, for instance, say in the hard sciences, illnesses. It can be very taboo, and certainly with more progressive people, right, to have any kind of indication that there is any biological difference. But in fact, there are all kinds of things within subpopulations. So you don't have to believe in sort of 19th century versions of race as, you know, as species or something to acknowledge that more African Americans have sickle cell than other groups. And you want to be able to study illnesses and physical phenomenon that affect people. And so a balance of not dismissing people and condemning people with these kind of categories, but also to deal with real biological things in their complexity.
Very wise words, even if they're controversial, from Philip Kadish, The Great White Hoax, 2 Centuries of Selling Racism in America. It's out this week. Thank you again, Philip, for your work and your wisdom. And
Thank you for having me.
We look forward to hearing more from you. It's an important subject, and unfortunately, it's not going away. Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir.